Okay, so let's get started and welcome everyone to this interim meeting of the core working group. I am Marco Tiloca, my co-chair is Jaime Jimenez. And this is an official IETF meeting, so we've been recorded already. The not well displayed here applies. If you're not familiar already with it, become familiar with it. It's not only about IPR, it's also and especially about our code of conduct. So please be nice and professional with each other. That said, as to the agenda for today, we start with a status update on the two core-conf documents under ISG review. So Young Cibor and SID. We've had progress on both. Also an update on recent progress in href especially, and discussion points on Coral. We have had recently resubmitted an href version. And then we enter into group communication territory. We have updates both on the group Combis document with an open PR and the group score document to discuss a few selected points on a review received recently from ESCO. Does anyone want to bash this agenda today? Or any other comment before we start? Karsten?
So, Christian, how much time do you need on Coral itself?
I plan to make this short, like 5 minutes, just mention the issues and give everyone a brief and a very short understanding of there is this point, and if you have input, place it there.
Great, because I'm trying to judge how much we can overdraw on CoreConf. And
yeah, I'll make this as short as it need be.
Good, thank you.
And I plan to take minutes most of the time, but any help there is much appreciated. Thank you. Okay, then I think we can start with the first item. It's Karsten. If it works for you, you can share the slides yourself. All right, please go ahead.
So I had to find the unmute as usual. Okay, so I want to talk about two things quickly, and these are in one slide set for economy. So the CI part is actually already the next agenda item. So let's talk about CoreConf. Just as a reminder, there are 4 documents on the plate of the working group. 2 are in the ISG, 2 are in working group plus call past stage, but yeah, essentially it seems that there will be some fallout from the processing of the first 2 documents, so we may need to rev these one or two times to actually submit them to ISG. So I talk about the first 2, and the plan with the ISG processing was to do the discuss clearing first, and the plan was to be done by this time, but we aren't done yet, and I'll explain why. So the Yang Cibor document has cleared the discusses, and as usual, there is a weird status in the data tracker. Anyway, so this really should be revised. I need it because we still have to process the comments on this document, and that's going to be next after we have cleared the core-SID discuss. And on core-SID, we had several discusses. One is remaining, and of this single discussed by Rob Wilton, only 1 item is remaining. So we are pretty far advanced, but that item turns out to be rather interesting, and it's not one where I thought as a document author or really document finisher I should be trying to make a decision here, because it's not easy. We'll see. The discuss from Rob Wilton really is not about something that's totally core to the Yang issues here, but about the idea to have this global namespace, the SIDs, the schema identifiers, and of course these SIDs somehow need to reflect evolution of the underlying schema definitions, which in our case is the Yang definitions. And we already tried to change the text in CORE-SID twice based on previous comments by Rob, but that really allowed him to sharpen his comment a little bit, so it's a bit easier to understand. And so essentially the question is, how does the mapping between SIDs and names evolve for a module that is evolving? So Yang modules have a name and a prefix, and these modules can evolve. They can make non-backwards compatible changes. And of course, the question is, how do we actually evolve the SIDs that are attached to the items in the schema? And the current document takes the position that the SID should be attached to the semantics of the item. And actually, one interesting criteria here is, does the CBOR encoding of the item change? Then apparently its structure changed and its semantics must have changed. It's not so clear what exactly that means, but that might be an operable definition we have in the document right now. So that's what we thought we would be going with. But the alternative would be to take a much more bureaucratic approach and just say SIDs map to item names. And well, if you change the name of a schema item, there must have been a reason for that. So it's usually also okay to change the SID with that. And on the other hand, if you don't change the item name, then really you are expecting that item to still have a similar meaning after evolving the Yang schema. So that would be a point of view on attaching the SID to item name. And I probably need to add here, this is about the time when a module actually has been published. So there is some promise of stability with that module. It's pretty clear during internet draft time, we are throwing things around and changing names and so on. So this happens all the time. And I would expect that when we just have a plain name change, we actually keep the SID. But this is about the situation when the module actually has been published. So there should be a stable module, a stable SID to name mapping. And we only touch it again when we have a very conscious updating of the module revision. And then we have to think about how we update the SID. So this threshold may or may not coincide with the time when the document is published as an RFC. I think we have some very different religious views on this, and I'm more on the side. Once you have promised the thing to be stable, then you have to operate on the stable side, and it's not that important whether it's an RFC already or not. Anyway, so the advantage of attaching the SID to the semantics is that you isolate implementations from name changes. And well, yeah, that's great, but why would one change a name in a published module? So if the name is Disney, then there might be a reason to change a name to avoid a trademark conflict. But yeah, we usually don't publish modules that have trademark conflicts in them. So it's not so clear that this is a lot of a benefit. But on the other hand, this also means that if the semantics changes behind name, then we can allocate a new SID and isolate implementations from that semantic change, or actually make it more aware, more obvious that a semantics change has occurred. So Andy says that SID to name mapping, he says SID to path mapping, but that's the same thing here, does depend on module revision date tuples used in the SID file. So when you have a new revision date, your path mapping changes. And further, if the module uses groupings, which is a way to bundle things for export, groupings from other modules, then those revision dates also matter. So you essentially have to have a pretty good map of the landscape of revision dates before you actually can choose the right SID. And he says if we can accept that Yang files can change in non-backward compatible ways, then the same has to be accepted for SID files. And that's probably true, but Rob had some comments on that. So let's go to the alternative. When we attach to the SID to the name, we avoid a number of problems that Rob Wilton notes in his discuss comment, which unfortunately only went to the authors, chairs, and ISG. So I think that's a little bit of a problem with transparency here. So sorry for unveiling this 12 days after we got the comment, but initially I thought we actually could handle this, but it's a bit hard. So he says a controller that understands two different SID values for a given leaf, because we have updated the SID value for that leaf between module changes. When configuring two devices, then the device will understand a specific version of the module. So a Yang server, RESTconf server, or CoreConf server will only understand one revision normally. So it's the job of the client, of the management station to understand potential different revisions of a module. So this isn't exactly new, but here it would add the complication that it not only needs to understand that there are different revisions of this module, which usually are designed carefully so you don't break existing implementations a lot. You would also have to distinguish two different SID values. So I consider this manageable, but it is a burden that we have to keep in mind. So the alternative would be to put more logic into the client. I'm not quite sure whether Rob really means clients here or servers here, but yeah, somebody has to carry the onus of the changed SID value, and it can be the client or it can be the server, but somebody gets the short straw here. Well, okay, that's an interesting observation, but by itself, I think that this is not yet completely convincing. But then Rob notices that essentially what Andy said, that SID is a binding to a namespace, a name, and a set of module revisions where this SID actually applies. And of course, this set will probably expand in the future. So you cannot know the entire set. You can only know a snapshot of the set up to which your knowledge of the registrations actually goes. And he sees a number of problems with that. So one question would be, when do we actually allocate new SIDs? Yeah, then we need a set. We could also allocate new SIDs each time we change the module, so we get completely new SIDs, but then of course we use a lot of SID numbers, and that's actually absolutely the inverse of what we are trying to do here. There's something in the chat I probably need to read. Yeah, okay. Good. So this did go to the core mailing list, but yeah, this was still in the vacation time, so I'm not sure that everybody saw that. Yeah, I'm not sure there is no need to read it out loud. Yeah, and then again, each Yang server implements a single revision. What does it actually do? Thank you. What does it actually do with SIDS that actually come from a different module? So this is probably just a robustness consideration. Again, something we might be able to sweep away. But really his interesting argument here is if you have a middle box translating between SIDS and names, then that would also need to know the schema revision information to perform the translation correctly. And that made me blush a little bit because I mean, we are the working group here that looks at proxies and making proxies useful and so on. And translating proxy between SIDS and names is something that is entirely thinkable. In particular, if the proxy is not only translating between SIDS and names, but also has RESTconf on one end and CORE-conf on the other end. So it would be using names on the RESTconf side and SIDS on the CORE-conf side. So this is actually a piece of software that we definitely should not make impossibly hard to do. And this is a bit of a convincing argument for me that making the mapping between SIDS and names more complicated is undesirable. Now, these proxies are hard to do without schema information for other reasons. The RESTconf, the Yang JSON mapping is not a schema-free mapping. So you have to know a little bit about the schema to actually write that proxy. But I still can imagine doing a successful proxy without schema revision information, with occasional creaking at the joints. Yeah, I wouldn't want to actually kill that kind of product. So yeah, can we actually reap the benefits of this more or less static SID to name mapping that Rob is advocating here? If yes, then we may have to weigh that against the other benefit that mapping to semantics would provide. So I don't know if anybody has an immediate reaction to this, but this is the decision we will have to make within the next days and weeks to get rid of that final discuss.
Christian, I have an immediate question here. If we were to stick with the SID means semantics variation, wouldn't that imply that if there are two names that both apply to those semantics, either would be good for a proxy to produce?
Well, the on the way back from the server to the client, it would have to choose which of these two names to use.
Right.
So choosing the wrong one will make the client blow up.
The same would be true if the SID sticks with the name and there's just a disagreement between what the name currently means.
Yes, but the difference here is the SID to name mapping is something that kind of happens as an afterthought. So people are not necessarily curating that carefully to keep these middle boxes possible. While the actually changing a name or changing the semantics behind a name is something that would be considered very, very carefully by people who are evolving a module. So the module designer or the module evolver is actually in this picture and will make sure that the damage from changing the names is somewhat limited.
That sounds reasonable. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really hard to decide these things when you don't have 20 implementations out there with implementers shouting at you. But we have to forecast a little bit what people actually will be doing. And I think this idea of a translating proxy is rather useful in a mixed RESTconf CoreConf world, and we should do everything we can to keep that possible. Okay, Esco.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Unmuting. So I'm just wondering, is there also a problem with different versions of a module, so that you also give the complete module, I think, a SID number? So what if then another version of that module pops up? So is that actually an issue, that it needs another SID number, or is that not needed?
Well, the module might need a SID number. Actually, I don't know. I would have to look up whether that's the case. That's a good question. But still, the contents of that module could remain stable as much as possible.
Yeah, at least the way I've used SIDs, there was a kind of base number, I think, that describes a set of sub-elements. I thought it was related to module. And then you basically use relative numbers for these sub-elements, so you have a bit of compression. And then the module number is kind of the number of the root that you use, so the first number. I was just considering if the module gets versioned, so would that SID also need to use basically a different base number, or can it use the same base number?
Well, you normally don't see module numbers in data node items.
Right. No, it's not carried there.
You see the top level of this compression tree is usually a container or some other top level item within the schema. You don't identify the module, you identify the top level item. And since this item has a namespace, that namespace indirectly indicates a family of modules. And there we are, because we have this family on the namespace side, and this should somehow fit with the SID world, where also the same SID should be used for that family. But you can completely abstract away the compression thing here, because that's kind of independent. The compression will be resolved by the time you actually look at the data.
Yeah, so you can just get basically numbers for all the items.
Yeah, the compression is schema free.
Right, yeah, that's right. So yeah, ideally you want to keep the SIDs the same across multiple versions. That's what you also indicated in the slide. So not change all the SIDs every time something gets versioned. Yeah.
yeah, there are some pretty weird things in the Yang JSON world where, for instance, if you go from 32-bit to 64-bit numbers, then the data changes between integers and strings and so on. I think on the RESTCONF side, the clients, the management stations will already be used to doing weird things. So I think they will be rather robust. As long as we don't create a new problem for them, but just a problem on the encoding side, we should be pretty much safe here. Okay, so I think we need to have another meeting of the design team, but if you have a position on this, it would be really interesting if you could send something to the mailing list. While we have invented SIDS for encoding Yang, SIDS are actually useful as a more generalized namespace. So you might find yourself writing a Yang module just to get SIDS at some point in the future, because it's a nice alternative to ASM1 object identifiers or creating new registries and so on. So I would like to keep these as useful as possible. Okay, I have stolen like 5 minutes here. Any other comments? Then let's quickly go to the Coral part. And I have slides for the href part of Coral. Just as a reminder, the href document defines CRIs, which are concise resource identifiers, essentially the structured binary equivalent to uniform reference identifiers, which are the one uniform resource identifiers, which of course you all know and are defined in RFC 3986. We have submitted Dasho 9 recently, and part of that actually already was discussed in the December interim. We introduced CDDL features as a way to talk about more esoteric parts of this structure. And we also recognized that percent encoded text in URIs really are byte strings. And this also allowed simplifying the encoding. And we also remembered that fragments can have percent encoded text as well. So this is old. Now, what's new is we have removed the part that said a CRI removes any lone empty path segment. So if you have a URI with a single path segment and that is empty, this is now different at the CRI level from a URI without a path segment. And you can see that in the example here. So coap ://foo/ leads to a CRI with one empty path segment as the third element of the top level array. And if we leave off that slash, then we get a different CRI. Now this is maybe a little bit surprising if you know schemes like coap and HTTP. Both schemes actually have a built-in equivalence. So we actually have rules in the various documents that talk about how to use the URI schemes that provide an equivalence here. So these two CRIs are equivalent in the scheme. The scheme coap tells us these two mean the same. But at the structure level of the URI, without looking at the scheme, they are different. And therefore, it's not really the job of the URI encoding to exercise this equivalent. So we took that out. On the other hand, of course, this means if you actually generate, for instance, co-op options from this, then you have to implement the same rule that you already had for URIs, for CRIs as well. If you have a lone empty path segment, then you leave it off. That's actually defined in RFC 7252. So you would continue to do that instead of having the CRI layer do it for you, because it happens to know that the schemes that CRI likes have this equivalent. So why are we doing this now? We are doing this now because we have been pushed towards looking other schemes. For instance, the DID, decentralized identifier scheme that W3C is so fond of. So we have been pushed into making sure that the CRI scheme, the CRI mechanism is scheme agnostic. And this is the one thing that needed to happen for that. And while we were doing that, we decided that we would want to have an appendix where we collect the weird examples, because we don't want to load down the main text of the document with the weird things. We want to talk about the normal things in the main text. So the weird examples will be banished to this appendix. And that's -09 now. And what's next is making sure all of our implementations can do this. So the behavior that -09 provides actually was an existing bug of my implementation, which is now a feature. So you actually can get different output from coop//foo and coop//foo/ already. This is something that was already present, but we have to make sure that our implementations actually work with the whole document. And in particular, we have a pull request with test vectors, and we need to make sure that these all work and also are sufficiently complete that we can give that to implementers and say, if you run these, then you can be pretty sure that your implementation is fine. So that's where we are with CRIs. Questions? Then I hand over to Christian.
Yep, thank you. So the focus of work in the CRI/CORE design team meetings has been CRIs recently. There are two issues tracked in the issue tracker that I'd like to point out to you. They're also referenced in the minutes. One is one that I'd like to complete rather soon. That is the decision of whether this is all an open world or closed world system, with the proposed resolution to allow both, but give guidance towards building open world systems because they work better. There is an example in the issue that I can briefly copy paste over into the minutes as a quick replacement for screen sharing. That is, where did I have this open right again? That is about gremlins. So if you say something like this, there is a way for feeding these, and this works by going to feed gremlins, and then there is additional information that says, and by the way, don't do this after midnight. Things might go wrong if there are partial representations around. We don't expect to have partial representations all the time, but it could easily be that a few tools work better if they allow them. So guidance would be to rather implement things like in the second example, to say at the very point in time where you say that there's a way of feeding, that there are limitations and that you can only feed if you satisfy any of those. And then you list the allowed times before midnight, and thus can be sure that if there's partial information, the form doesn't get acted on at all. And so this all is failing safe. If you have any ideas about these, please approach me, us, say something now or input it into the issue. The other issue that is not as clear-cut yet is the issue of saying something about the security model. This is not only about forms, although it came up in the context of forms, but it's just the same about links. I think that we now have distinguished a bit more clearly, at least in the internal discussions, that what we expect to produce is not something precisely like what is happening in the web, but more informed by the application that is driving it. That is, unlike in the web, we don't have to make sense from a user clicking on a link, but we have to make sense of an application saying that it wants to, with these characteristic, with these characterized authorizations, perform a particular action. Now that characterization may not exactly match the forms model, but it has to in some way put boundaries on in one direction which authorizations can be used at all, and in the other direction what assurances from the server about from the source of the form about the authenticity of the form data has to be provided. We have a few corner cases in the issue. If you have input for that, we'd appreciate that. Please also just have a look at the examples there and the corner cases, so that we can be sure to cover the relevant topics, not in terms of providing a full security model, because that would be what ACE and OAuth provide, but in terms of providing the hooks into which security system authorization models can be tied. Carsten?
The real reason why this is a problem for Coral can best be explained by an anecdote. I have this information security class that I'm running for 15 years now. And at some point, we had a pen testing assignment where people were running local copies of a system that is also used at the university and try to find problems with that. And at some point, a student found a problem and sent a mail with a proof of concept URI. The URI was enough to trigger the problem to one of the administrators. So that administrator knew about this proof of concept URI, and that was the objective of the mail from the student, and that's fine. But then the administrator forwarded that URI to another administrator. And the other administrator didn't quite know why the URI was in this mail and thought the first administrator was telling them the URI to click on it, to try this out. And so one administrator tricked the other administrator into breaking our course management system. And of course, they were not happy. And this is exactly what can happen in a Coral document, that one entity provides a URI to another entity, but if the other entity doesn't know why it should follow that thing, and also, of course, what security context it should be using for following that thing, then this can be a very dangerous situation. And that's exactly what we have to avoid in the context of Coral, and of course, in the context of any hypermedia system.
Thanks for the good anecdote. It clarifies very well. Any more question, comments for Carsten or Christian on Coral? Okay, no, thanks. We can move on with ESCO group Combis. And ESCO, the PDF is available for sharing if you ask for authorization to share.
I think I see it. Let's see. Right.
If you look at the top left,
Yeah.
exactly.
Your slides, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll put it on.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so this is presenting an update of Group Combis. And what we're showing here is basically working towards version 6 of this draft. So we'll get started. So after the last meeting, there has been a request to add some more examples on particular topics, especially how to encode application group names in co-op requests if you want to discover these groups. And there are 2 open issues on that, so those are the only open issues at the moment. And to address this, we opened a new pull request, so that's shown at the bottom, number 32. So that should address all the open points to clarify how it works or can work, and also to have at the same time more examples shown of what message exchanges can be used. So yeah, people are free to review, of course, this pull request and to check it out. So here I'll go briefly through some of the content there, so not all, but some of it. So first topic we have in section 221, and that's basically the encoding of names of application groups. So there we added quite a bit of examples. And the structure of the section is also updated to accommodate that. So there are some ways to encode the name of an application group. You can have it, first point, in the group URI of the co-op request, and there it can be in various places. So those are the sub-bullets here. So you can have it in the path component, query, the authority component as a whole, the host subcomponent, or even in the port subcomponent. And those are presented now in the text. And there's a second class of ways to encode it, is basically have it in the co-op request as a kind of add-on, but not encoded in group URI, so not make it visible in the group URI. So there are 2 options shown, so you can use the URI option, URI host option for that, and you just add or replace that one just before sending with some custom information. In this case, that's the name of an application group. And you can also define a custom or new or application-specific co-op option to carry that information. And finally, the third one is to not have it at all on the wires. It's just implicitly derived based on the application context and the application software that is processing the requests. So there are quite a bit of choices there. So I'll just show an example here on the first one. So there we have an application group name. So this is GP1 here, underlined, and it shows up in the group URI as part of the URI path. And then in the draft, we now have a complete example also showing how this translates to our co-op requests with the different options in here. And maybe important to note here that we use as the host, we use a host name, group.example.org. So this will also, well, by applying the proper co-op parsing, this will translate to a URI host option in the co-op request. I think we also mentioned there that often in implementations, this URI host option is not there because the server normally doesn't actually use it. So it just looks at a UDP level addressing information, and based on that, it can basically derive the correct URI host and serve the correct content. So it normally doesn't need to be actually encoded in the request, but for clarity of these examples and correctness, we just apply it here. Let me see. So question from Christian, is this about the current slide or?
Yeah, this is about basically the third bullet, first sub bullet. So maybe you'll cover that anyway.
Yeah, no, I was not planning to explain more about it, but yeah, basically, let me think about that. So the question is, okay, how can it not be in the group URI, but it can be in the URI host option. Well, it's very simple. Suppose you start with a group URI, and it's actually not shown in the slide here, but suppose this group.example.org here is there, it's not there, and then you replace that by an IPv6 literal multicast address. So with the square brackets and IP multicast address. So if you do that, then the URI host option disappears here again. So correct? Then you can send the request without URI host option. So now the trick is you do first the translation from group URI to the actual co-op request with headers. And then in your implementation code, you might have in your co-op stack a process that basically adds it back in. So it basically adds the URI host option with some custom value basically in there.
Yeah, but then that is the group URI. Then you're just providing another way of inputting the host name independently, but it's still part of the group URI. So it might make a difference from an API side, but
I wanted to say it's actually not, because if you take a group URI, that also means you're sending it to basically the authority that's listed here. If you use an IPv6 multicast address literal, for example, here, that means you're not going to resolve the name group.example.org, but you're just going to send it over UDP to that IPv6 address, so using the literal. And that means that whatever you put in the URI host option, you could see it as a kind of misusing the URI host option. So whatever you put in there is not actually used to choose the UDP destination of the packet. So in that sense, it's not part of the group URI. It's only added, let's say, in the last instant, just before sending it out. You can consider that it's added back in. So the group URI is already defined, has already been parsed, and that's all done. And now you can still decide to add some option in the co-op request, some option that's not, basically not encoded in group URI. So it could be a comment if we say here, like, hey, wait a minute, that's like a misuse of URI host, or that's incorrect in a way, then okay, I can understand that. So in that case, it's maybe better to use a custom option. So it's the second sub bullet. So you have some specific my group option in co-op that you use to encode the group. But this is why we put these as separate options, because you can use URI host to do that. And the reason is that normally that option is not used in the actual co-op encoded request. So normally if you send to group URI, group.example.org, you can basically resolve that to a multicast address and then decide to basically not send the URI host option because the server doesn't do anything with it. So instead you use it for something else. Yeah, okay. So we can discuss more about that offline. So it might not be the kind of best or recommended way of doing things. But I think we put it in because it came up in earlier discussions in the core working group as a way to do it. So I'll now move on to the next slide. It shows now that you can also encode it in the query component. So there are two ways shown. So you either use the entire query component, so that's the top one. You just have a GP1 query, which is the name of the group. Or you have other parameters too, and then you might want to use the key equals value syntax. So then you have something like GP equals GP1 to encode the group. And this is, for the rest, it's quite straightforward. And all this text with example is by the way, in the pull request, so you can also review it there. So also for section 223, group discovery, we basically have revised the text and put some concrete discovery scenarios with extended examples. So we'll go through 2 examples here. So the first one is this. So given a co-op group that is known, a client may want to discover all the associated application groups. So what application groups are all using this co-op group. And it may want to also know which servers are in that co-op group, basically, having some application groups. So then this shows an example of discovery. So there's one always at the top, a request line, and then there are responses from 2 or 3 servers, an example. So the known co-op group is in red underlined, and that's where also the request is sent to using .well-known core, so you can get link format results. And what it does here, it's basically looking for a particular resource type, and within this custom application context, the resource type starts with G dot to indicate the group. And then the thing after the dot is some information about the type of group in this particular example for a particular application. And the servers then respond back with those resources that have that type. So you can see GP1 is a light group, which is supported by both servers, and then GP2 is a temperature control or temperature reading group, which is supported only by server 2. Yeah, and again, this type of encoding is, you can say, rather application specific, but yeah, we also give examples of other ways of encoding, but I'm not showing those here in the presentation. So there's no kind of, as you will know, uniform standard how to do that. And this shows another example. So you have an application group which has a known name, and you want to discover the associated co-op group. So it's the other way around. Also the servers again, and the resources in the group. So now you start with the known in red. So the basically application group name. So you know the path encoding of that. So that's in our examples, it's always /GP/something. GP1 is here the group name. So you basically look for those resources using a href query sent to all co-op nodes in a particular scope. So again, you get 2 responses here from 2 servers. So in green, you can see that also the co-op group is responded. And after that, yeah, you see again the requested application group, GP1. And you have a resource type also indicating the type of the group. So in this application example, the RT contains some information again about the type of group. Okay, and I think we also provide a little bit of explanation in the draft, well, why this URI link returned here is an absolute URI, while in the previous example it was a relative URI. That due to the way that link formats work. And importantly, once you get these responses from service S1 and S2, you can also discover what are the resources within each group. So there you use, for example, unicast discovery. That seems to be the most efficient because you can get a long list back. So the idea is we just say that you can use unicast discovery to find resources on a particular server, for example, within a particular group. So using wildcard queries is one way to do that in link format. So you can, for example, ask all sub-resources of group GP1 at one particular server. Okay, so I think these are the examples for this section. And then there's another one added. So in an appendix, a bit lengthy examples of message exchanges in group communication in general. So a very plain example is that client sends multicast requests and then responses follow. And this is what is shown here on the right. Let's see, there's a second example using observe notifications with multicast, and a third example using blockwise. So all of the things that are explained in the text are now also clarified with additional simple examples. Okay, any questions on these examples here or of the previous slide? If not, we might go to the next steps. So if there's no objection to the content, we can hopefully merge this pull request soon and submit it as a version 6 draft. Of course, once it is in version 6, we can still get reviews. That's not a problem. We also can do the reviews for the pull request at this moment. It's still open. And if all is accepted and well, we can then close the remaining open issues. And then we think this version 6 might be ready for the working group last call. It's the next step. So thanks. Here's also a link to the open issues and the pull requests if you want to check it out. So any questions on this?
No, and I don't see any in the chat either, or in the minutes.
Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you, Dan Esko. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, then we'll just proceed with the proposal, I think. Yeah.
Okay, then we can move on to the last set of slides that I can present on GruppoScore. All right, so this is also ongoing work on the next expected version 14 of the GruppoScore document. And we did have version 13 after IETF 112 that went through the second working group last call. And we have already received very good reviews from ESCO. Thank you very much for that. In two separate parts. So the main comments were first mail, then more editorial comments and nits followed. They're already addressed and merged into the editor's copy. And there's also one more review coming in soon. But for today, we went through the main points from ESCO, and we selected a few that can deserve some early discussion with the group to be sure that what we have in mind is a good direction before we start working on the document. So I selected a few, and this was, I think, the most interesting to consider about the format and actually the storage of public keys. First of all, we definitely have to improve the use of terminology, because right now we are using public key in two ways to mean both the actual public key, say to verify signatures, but also to refer to the broader container, including also the public key, which is authentication credential. So for sure, we'll rephrase sections of the document to use the two terms consistently as we mean it. But then the main point of ESCO, so thinking of authentication credentials, was that we are storing them entirely to use them especially for two processes, also summarized here in the slide: deriving pairwise keys and filling the external AAD for cryptographic binding between requests and responses. Yes, we are storing them entirely intentionally, and we think that is a good thing to do in spite of course, the resulting storage overhead. In particular, as they're issued by the original issuer, those credentials include even a lot of metadata, not only the fundamental signature algorithm, but also think of issuer, subject, key use, and expiration for the public key. And most important, this ensures that all endpoints here are going to consider exactly the same bytes as released by the original issuer when using the authentication credentials for those two procedures. So you can see that as a trade-off between the storage you have to live with and the complexity that you'd otherwise run into in defining, as also you mentioned in your review, Esko, the relevant subset of metadata to consider and how to encode them in a canonical way. And you have to do that for every credential, keep those definitions up to date, and repeat the exercise for every possible future credential to be introduced later on. So putting all this together, a reasonable proposal can be, well, to keep the storage of whole credentials as of now, but to explain better these points and especially clarify the trade-off that you have to deal with between storage and complexity on the other side. Would this be a good way forward? Are there objections?
I would say it's a good way forward to keep storing the whole ones, because like you said, there's so much complexity and you have to define this for all existing credential types and any possible future ones coming up also. So.
Thank you, Richard. There's a question from Karsten on the chat. What is relevant subset? Defining what is relevant would also be part of the definition exercise. So that's also...
Can you just give some numbers here? I mean, what's the whole thing going to be, and how many bytes, and how many bytes would a relevant subset maybe be? How much would we save?
Well, really minimally, it's the public key plus the signature algorithms. But then, of course, you have also to define the encoding you're interested in for that subset. And as far as I understand, all this is relevant or applies to ad hoc just as well, with similar considerations, I believe.
So this could be done in less than 100 bytes.
Probably.
Okay.
There's
people in the queue. I think Esko was first.
Yeah, I'm not queued, but I was thinking maybe I'll say something. So we had in some prior work hit that point for X509 certificates specifically. So there was, well, you can have the whole certificate, and that's for constrained implementations. Yeah, we usually ended up somewhere between 0.5 and 1 kilobyte for a certificate. So that's the complete credential. And from that, you can, for some cases, you can only take the public key part, and that was needed to put in a field of a particular bootstrapping protocol. That was the context over the Bruce key bootstrap protocol. So the public key is, you can say, a smaller subset of the certificate. I don't recall how much the public key was, the X509, including the signature algorithm and such. So the format for that, once you agree it's clear, but you have to really be very precise in specifying it, because we ended up with 3 different understandings of how it could be encoded. So it's just taking a very particular part of bytes from the X509 certificate, but you have to know and define exactly which byte. So it doesn't need to be specifically defined as something new, but you need to define it as in a very exact way to become interoperable. I'm not sure about the size though. Well, it's probably less than 100 bytes, I think, but I don't remember that. I can look up some examples.
Yeah, Michael is also suggesting in the chat it's around 200 bytes for ECDSA certificates and more for RSA.
Yeah, so the ones I've been working with the interop work is like mostly 500 to 1,000 bytes in that area, depending on what you put in. So that depends on what people choose to put in and how long the strings are, etc. So the public key is much shorter than that, but Yeah, that was, I don't recall the size. So I think it should be less than 200 bytes, but let me check.
Thanks. Göran?
Yeah, I think what might need to be stated in the draft, and also, I mean, for this discussion, is, I mean, the relevant subset wouldn't that, if you know what the relevant subset is, couldn't you choose a credential if the storage limitations are really strict? Couldn't you choose a credential that contains essentially the relevant subset? So I mean, if you only need the public key, if that is the relevant subset, maybe the entire X509 is not the right credential. And
yeah, you don't, maybe no need to store, but maybe for some applications you do need to store the entire credential for proper authentication. Because if you only store the public key, well, you only know that, hey, this is a trusted device that authenticates, but you cannot link it to any other information of the device, like, okay, who was the vendor, or what role does it have in the current network deployment, or which authority, basically which name of authority created that certificate. All that information is not kept. But I was thinking for the purpose of OSCORE GroupCom, yeah, ideally you might want to use a data item for a public key that's as small as possible. But so yeah, there is some problem involved in defining it, like that's also on the slide. So you would need to define that for all the, for every type of certificate that exists, or every type of credential.
And to give more context, the exact authentication credential to use in a group is up to decide for a group administrator creating the group, and this is then ultimately enforced on the group manager. So it's not something that the group members really negotiate. So probably it's a good thing to think from the start, considering the kind of deployment I'm going to have, is just better to go for this authentication credential type, considering the impact it would have on storage.
Yeah, what you were saying is that the group manager can also select it. So what if it selects a subset of the certificate and deploys that to all the nodes? Would that work?
It is practically enforcing what decided by a human being as an administrator, of course. But yes, it is the group manager authoritatively saying, this group works this way. This is the authentication credential type used here.
Yeah, but maybe it doesn't need to be defined then in OSCORE GroupCom draft. You just
no. This draft is just listing some examples of possible credential types to use.
Yeah, just give some recommendations that for, I think for the case of X509 certificates, it needs to be minimally the public key and the signature algorithm. That those are already encoded as one element. But it can be more, I think, based on what the group manager decides there.
Sure, that's up to the issuer of a certain credential of a certain endpoint, what that contains. Thing is, any other endpoint should take it verbatim to store it as is and use it as is.
Yeah, okay then. That's why I was saying that maybe we don't need to say in this draft, like it needs to be the entire X509 certificate. It doesn't need to be then, apparently.
Sure, the entire credential is issued, whatever it exactly contains when it was issued.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I think this is a good comment, Esko. This needs to be clarified in the text, exactly what is the role of the credential, and what is the possibility to decide on that. Who decides on what credentials being used in this setting?
Yeah, and it can be a custom format as well, defined by the group manager.
Sure.
So not necessarily something standard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But if you're just asking the question about sizes here, if so, the input from Michael was that certificates were around 200 bytes, then the public key would be, and signature algorithm would be less than half of that. So I suppose that's not a major hurdle, those 200 bytes, compared to the 1 kilobyte you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it depends on the group size. So if you have a constrained device and let's say you have 50 group members and then 50 kilobytes, yeah, still, I don't know, might be rather a lot, depending on the platform, of course. But
yeah, if you need to communicate, everyone needs to communicate with everyone else. I mean, typically, maybe there is if in this multicast session, there are maybe not everyone is a sender.
1, 2, or 3 clients, basically. Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, can also be.
Okay, so it seems like overall this direction here is good enough to consider for a first draft revision. So keeping overall this approach, but clarifying a lot on the details and the trade-off.
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you for the input. Yeah, the second biggest comment I selected was, I mean, it looked to me mostly as a request for clarification on why we're doing a certain thing and how it helps. We introduced something last year in the draft out of a suggestion from Christian. Basically, when a certain endpoint joins the group, it receives from the group manager the current group ID using the group, say G1. And from then on, that group ID is going to be the birth GID of that endpoint. And you can apply the same to any other endpoint. So of course, for many different reasons, the group manager can rekey the group. That can happen multiple times. And every time that happens, the group ID changes. Now, the details here depend a lot on the specific policies the group manager considers for picking up a new group ID, how that is formatted, encoded, and so on. But at some point, the group manager will run out of available group IDs that have never been used before, and it will start to reassign already used group ID values in the past. So until last year or so, we were actually forbidding this because that was going to create a problem in the security of very, very long-living observations. But Christian suggested to introduce this concept of birth GID, which enables to safely recycle group ID values, so to make the group live forever, in principle, while not incurring into any unsecure long-living observations. And the trick is that if the group manager is going to rekey the group and assign a group ID that coincides with any birth GID of any group member, well, then that group member is also going to be evicted in that very rekeying process. So that evicted node will just have to rejoin the group, basically becoming a new endpoint. And when doing so, it terminates its observation. So solving the original problem we had by construction. And all this is summarized in a very short single sentence that I quoted here. And we intentionally did not explain any of this in detail. We didn't provide any example because it sounds a lot like discussing design considerations that we did have. But maybe it is useful to add more explanations about this instead. And since security aspects of observation are involved here, maybe the security consideration sections is a good spot. What do you think about this way forward then?
Yeah, for me, as a, well, making this comment, I I thought it was really complex, and it seemed to be for a case that will not be reached in practice, like running out of group IDs. How could that happen, basically? How many group IDs are there? That's maybe the question. So if you want to do it, and if it's really kind of a corner case, so that normally you don't run out of group IDs, then I would do something like this, maybe in a separate section or maybe appendix or so. Now it was really at the front of the draft, and to me it seemed quite complex and confusing. So you want to keep a node as a group member, and then you still need to evict it for this security reasons. It wasn't all too clear why that all needs to happen. So maybe it needs to say like, okay, well, if you want to ever reuse a group ID, so normally you don't do it, but if you really run out for some reason, then you need to look into that appendix and then do as there. Otherwise, you can also build a system that does not allow to you reuse group IDs, right? So just yeah, isn't that possible that you say just if the group manager can just evict everyone from the group and basically start counting, use a new group ID again, or maybe reuse one, start with one, for example, and then just provide new key material for everyone. Isn't that also solving the problem then?
Before I speak, people are in the queue.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, don't put in a mechanism that will never occur in interop testing, that will never be exercised, that will not be implemented by a number of people. We need to make sure that the parts that actually make the protocol work are also parts that are being used.
A brief note on the topic of running out never happens. This depends on how large GIDs you want to afford. So if you just accept very brief GIDs to not let your messages exceed some bound, then you might say have a nibble for the group for distinguishing different groups, and another nibble for counting your rekeyings, or say a byte for each, and then you can realistically run into that condition. I agree that it might be a good idea to have some servers that just say, yeah, we can't do arbitrarily short group IDs and we just never rekey. But this is something that the client doesn't need to have an active part in, so the group manager can just do that. Not even sure if it's so much of an interrupt concern, because a device being kicked out is something that can happen, and anything else that happens just as in that case.
Yeah, so you're saying the complexity is only on the group manager. So if the group manager wants to provide very small numbers, then it also needs to do that extra work, like either kick everyone out or kick out the nodes with a particular birth GID.
Yes.
Yeah, but okay, I'm just saying that for a reader, all this text, it seems rather complex, arbitrary, and scary, and you might want to not have that in front of the draft.
Yeah, I think we should definitely give more context around this in that section already, and then maybe as a dedicated appendix. But a main input I got from you before, Esko, was to say that a group manager can potentially actually enforce a policy to never recycle group IDs, actually. And well, in that case, when the possible values are possibly finished, the group is shut down, and that's it, right?
Yeah, that can also be
okay.
Kind of the easy way out in a way,
Yeah.
or completely re-established the group with new key material, right? That should work.
So that was actually the original case. So we introduced this thing to make it possible to do something better, but I understand it has to be something optional, not just part of the picture necessarily.
Yeah, indeed. Now it looks really like a main part of the protocol, and maybe that's not how we want to have it. It's more like an optional thing that the group manager can do to improve, for example, these long-lived group memberships and observations too.
Okay, so a group manager that plans to recycle group IDs can use this mechanism to allow observations to continue, basically. And yes, all the logic would be on the group manager. Nothing really changes on the group members.
Yeah, and there might also be other benefits besides observe notifications, because not in every application they have observe active, I think, but could be benefits that you don't need to, for most members, you don't need to change the key material, for example, or it can just keep working without interruptions.
All right, noted. And I see you're agreeing also. Okay, so these two were the two difficult points, I'll say. What remains is easier, but still important to check with the group sooner than later. We have a section 10, mandatory to implement compliance requirements, exactly the same title and purpose of the corresponding section in the ad hoc document in Lake, by the way. And I got from one comment from ESCO that a title like that suggests the reader to expect only text using is mandatory to or must and shall. Well, instead, we also use non-normative statements and should recommend it. And what the text says now is basically what we actually mean to say. So a good fix for this, that I agree, it does require fixes, would be to simply change the section title to implementation compliance, because I think that's what we have meant all along. And that will still include both actual mandatory to implement requirements, but not only. Would this be good?
Yeah, okay. That sounds good.
Okay. That was actually easy. And then there was a cluster of comments about references that are now informative but used in normative statements, so to say. And the two things clash, also considering guidelines from the ISG that ESCO's review quoted. So I selected only a few of those most interesting ones. In the security consideration, there's a draft from John in CFRG about reintroducing randomness in deterministic signature schemes. And now we are essentially recommending normatively to use the draft if elliptic curve signatures are used. And to reply on the detailed point on the optional use of this thing and similar things, ESCO, I understood from that draft that if it is used, it works also on verifiers that are not supporting this approach themselves. So it works asymmetrically, which helps out, but still your point remains. So good options here can be, first of all, keeping the reference and informative, but then doing one of the following, simply switching to a non-normative recommended, or, and I think it's better, rephrasing that part of text altogether to still recommend normatively using approaches to reintroduce randomness, but present in this particular document as an example for doing that. Karsten.
Yeah, instead of making more or less normative statement, you also can make a factual statement that says, oh, by the way, when you use this, then you avoid the following security considerations.
Can you phrase your point in a different way?
Yeah, I'm trying to say that you don't have to have a normative or semi-normative statement in there. You can simply say, by using a scheme like this, you avoid a number of problems you will run into otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay, that could be like option 3 here to do
Indeed.
that. That sounds good. Also.
Sounds good. Any more? Oh, Göran.
Yeah, I have a little slight problem with number 2 there. I think we would like to, if we want to recommend something, we'd like to actually make precise reference. Because things might go wrong. And I mean, in this particular case, this draft is a little bit stalled because there are some considerations about how to do this right. So we can't really formulate the statement of this draft, and we shouldn't do that as in sort of as text. We should either point something that is agreed and ready, or we think that will become the right way to do it, or we should not do the normative recommendation, I think.
So Carsten's proposal address your concern then?
Yeah, except that it's not really clear what is the, I mean, in this case, because this is work in progress. So I'm not sure we can formulate it at this stage, exactly what properties we gain, which would be nice, of course. We could say that these are the properties you gain or you get. I think I'm slightly in favor of number 1 here, because we're then pointing to a work in progress document without binding us to do exactly this.
Yeah, the problem really is that if you change this, like in 1, the next thing the ISG will do is change it back. So you haven't really won anything. So this
Right.
is just trying to reduce the likelihood of an accident where in the end we have a normative reference that keeps this document in the RFC editor queue for half a decade or so.
Oh, okay. So how about doing as Carsten proposed, but not formulating what we get, but rather formulating the problem? And I mean, we can get back to exactly how we formulate it, but saying to avoid this problem, there are various techniques, and here is one example.
Yeah, I think that's what Carsten was proposing.
Okay, yeah, then
Well,
I misunderstood.
I think that Göran has a point here. What I phrased right now was making a factual statement of what this draft does. And that's, of course, difficult because the draft might evolve, so any factual statement about it is fundamentally broken. So it's better to say that technology is being developed right now and simply reference that document, but not say something about what this document does, but that the technology is being developed to do this.
And this is the class of problem addressed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. Okay, on the next 10 seconds from last point, it's a similar thing. It's still the same cluster of comment. It's about the ACE group manager defined in that draft. Right now here we are recommending it normatively. I think this can be addressed easily by just keeping this an informative reference, but relaxing the text around it to simply put this as an example of group manager to use, still having highlighted the features it has, and that would be it. Would be good. Or objections?
Yeah, I think relax, you mean not using the capitals?
Right, and phrasing it explicitly as just an example of group manager.
Yeah.
And that's it. And it's fine, actually. we should have done that from the beginning, probably.
Okay, yeah, is there a reason to keep it informative? Is that you have less waiting time on that, or?
Well, that document is pretty much aligned with this one at the moment in terms of process, but still, it's probably an overkill to have it as a normative reference or used normatively. So
okay, yeah, I can agree to that. Yeah.
Okay. Last but not least, and not long story short, it would be about promoting everything related to echo request tag to be normative. So right now the reference is informative. It's mainly used in an appendix as an example way to do challenge response synchronization, and it's the equivalent for groups of an appendix of OSCORE. But last year, the use and the importance of the echo option in group OSCORE as raised. Still not mandatory to implement, but it's intentionally the recommended method, not the only one, to solve another issue discussed in the document body. So putting all this together, considering also the status of the echo request tag document now, it makes total sense to make the reference actually normative and have the appendix becoming a section in the document body. I think. Any objections to that?
Yeah, that sounds good. I thought you also had it as a must requirement at some point in the text.
That's in the appendix itself, and by the way, we saw that in other similar and known appendices. This is maybe a bit controversial point, but if we make that appendix a section altogether, there'll be a non-problem.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, since we are in overtime already, I'm done. We need to start actually working on these comments, but it was good to have early feedback on those. And we'll process more comments as they come. And earlier today, I posted on the list a detailed reply to ESCO's review. So possibly we can continue there too. And yeah, we hope to have version 14 submitted before the next IETF meeting.
Thanks a lot, ESCO. Great review.
Thank you indeed.
Great, thanks.
Okay, and again, since we are over time, if there's no very last point anyone wants to raise, we can close the meeting and meet again in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Christian, for helping with the minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.